Ancient documents that would bring FBI agents and presidential historians racing to a forgotten wheat farm in Kansas. All discovered by one widow's desperate final attempt to save her late husband's legacy, the underground chamber that would prove the Civil War never truly ended. Before we dive deeper, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story grips you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we've got something even more incredible waiting for you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost clung to the dead wheat stalks as Sarah Mitchell's muddy boots crunched across the frozen ground of what had once been her family's pride. She surveyed the 280 acres of what locals now called Mitchell's Folly, a wheat farm in Harper County, Kansas that hadn't turned a profit in 3 years and was scheduled for bank foreclosure in exactly 72 hours if she couldn't produce the $47,000 in back payments. At 38, Sarah had never imagined herself as a farmer. She was a high school history teacher in nearby Wichita, someone who preferred dusty textbooks to dusty fields. But the farm had been in her late husband David's family for 4 generations, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing the last connection to the man she'd loved for 15 years. The property had been cursed with misfortune ever since David's grandfather had purchased it in 1952. Crop failures, equipment breakdowns, and a series of tragic accidents had driven away 3 different tenant farmers. The locals whispered about the Mitchell curse. But Sarah knew the real problem was simpler. The land was worn out. The infrastructure was crumbling, and modern farming required an investment they'd never been able to make. Really shoulda just walk away, said Tom Bradley, her late husband's best friend, and the only real estate agent willing to handle the property. He had driven out from Wichita to help Sarah with what everyone assumed would be her final visit before surrender. The bank's offer to forgive the remaining debt if you sign over the deed is generous. Considering the property's history, Sarah pulled her coat tighter against the Kansas wind, her eyes fixed on the old farmhouse that had stood since 1867. David had died there 6 months ago, struck down by a sudden heart attack while working alone in the basement, trying to repair the ancient furnace that had been giving them trouble for years. Paramedics said he'd been gone for hours before she found him. I know it doesn't make financial sense, Sarah replied, studying the foreclosure notice that had arrived that morning. Harper County Wheat Farm, 280 acres, historic homestead, 1867, original stone foundation, $47,000 minimum bid. Property sold as is. No inspections due to ongoing federal land survey complications. The last line had puzzled potential buyers, but Sarah had researched the survey issue. It appeared to be a routine geological assessment, related to groundwater rights that affected several farms in the county. Nothing that should impact the farm's value significantly. I can't explain it, Tom, she continued, but I feel like I owe it to David to try one more time. He was so convinced this place held some kind of historical significance. He spent his last months researching the property's past, going through old county records, even contacting the Kansas Historical Society. Tom shook his head, kicking at a clod of frozen earth. But that was just David being David, always looking for meaning in everything. But Sarah, you've already spent most of your savings trying to keep up with the mortgage. The teaching job barely covers your apartment rent. You can't save a farm that's been failing for 70 years. Sarah had done the math countless times. Between her teacher's salary, David's modest life insurance, and a loan against her retirement fund, she could maybe hold on to the property for 3 months. Her plan was ambitious and probably foolish: convert part of the historic farmhouse into a bed and breakfast focused on Civil War history. Partner with the local historical society for educational tours, and maybe develop a small research center, highlighting the farm's connection to the Underground Railroad. The farm sat along what had once been a crucial route for escaped slaves heading north to freedom. David had discovered references to the property in old abolitionist letters, suggesting the original owner had been a conductor in the Underground Railroad network. If Sarah could prove this connection and get the property listed on the National Register of Historic Places, there might be grants and tourism opportunities. Have you heard back from the Kansas Historical Society about the Underground Railroad research? Tom asked as they approached the farmhouse. Dr. Running Bear seemed interested, Sarah replied, referring to the Native American historian who specialized in 19th century Kansas. But she needs more than family stories to support a historic designation. The documentation requirements are extensive. The wind picked up, cutting through Sarah's jacket as she looked across the barren fields. The wheat that should have been green and thriving was brown and dead, another casualty of the drought that had plagued central Kansas for the past 2 years. Even if she could somehow save the farm from foreclosure, the environmental challenges seemed insurmountable. "Remember when we used to come out here for Sunday dinners?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a note of nostalgia. "David would drive us out from Wichita, and his grandmother would have that big table set up on the front porch. The fields were golden then, stretching as far as you could see." Tom nodded, his expression softening. "Grandma Mitchell made the best fried chicken in Harper County. David always said this place was magical, that it held stories nobody else knew about." "Maybe that's what I'm really trying to save," Sarah admitted. "Not just the property, but the stories. The history that dies with a place when it's sold to developers or corporate farms." She pulled out her phone and showed Tom the pictures David had taken during his research. Screenshots of old county records, photographs of faded documents, and images of the strange symbols he'd found carved into the basement stones. "Look at this," she said, swiping through the photos. David found these references in the Kansas State Historical Society archives, letters from abolitionists in the 1850s, talking about a safe house in Harper County. They never mention the exact location, but the descriptions match our property perfectly. Tom studied the images, his skepticism wavering slightly. "These letters are real?" "Copies of originals held at the Historical Society. Dr. Running Bear confirmed their authenticity. But she says we need physical evidence, not just documentary references, to prove the Underground Railroad connection." Sarah showed him another photo, a crude map drawn on aged paper, showing routes through Kansas with symbols marking safe houses. One symbol, circled in David's handwriting, appeared to correspond to their property's location. David was convinced. "That the farmhouse basement held evidence?" she continued. "He spent months down there, carefully removing layers of paint and mortar, looking for hidden compartments or messages left by the original builders. And did he find anything?" Hesitated. He died before he could finish his work. But in his final weeks, he was more excited than I'd seen him in years. He kept saying he was close to something big, that he'd found proof that would change everything. They reached the farmhouse porch, where David's old rocking chair sat covered in a thin layer of ice. Sarah paused, remembering the evenings they'd spent there, planning their future together. He'd been so passionate about the farm's potential, was convinced that its history held the key to their financial salvation. "Tom, what if David was right? What if there really is something significant here?" Tom considered this carefully. Ancient documents that would bring FBI agents and presidential historians racing to a forgotten wheat farm in Kansas. All discovered by one widow's desperate final attempt to save her late husband's legacy, the underground chamber that would prove the Civil War never truly ended. Before we dive deeper, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story grips you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we've got something even more incredible waiting for you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost clung to the dead wheat stalks as Sarah Mitchell's muddy boots crunched across the frozen ground of what had once been her family's pride. She surveyed the 280 acres of what locals now called Mitchell's Folly, a wheat farm in Harper County, Kansas, that hadn't turned a profit in 3 years and was scheduled for bank foreclosure in exactly 72 hours if she couldn't produce the $47,000 in back payments. At 38, Sarah had never imagined herself as a farmer. She was a high school history teacher in nearby Wichita, someone who preferred dusty textbooks to dusty fields. But the farm had been in her late husband David's family for 4 generations, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing the last connection to the man she'd loved for 15 years. The property had been cursed with misfortune ever since David's grandfather had purchased it in 1952. Crop failures, equipment breakdowns, and David found dozens of these letters, Sarah replied, all referencing a stone house in Harper County, describing secret chambers and hidden roots. He was convinced our farmhouse was this safe house. She showed Tom more documents receipts. For supplies delivered to the Harper County stone house, coded messages about packages and deliveries, and even a crude sketch showing the layout of a basement with what appeared to be hidden compartments. The problem is, Sarah continued, Dr. Running Bear needs physical evidence to support the documentary evidence. The letters prove there was Underground Railroad activity in Harper County, but they don't definitively prove it was at our property. Tom studied the sketch more carefully. Its basement layout. It looks like it might match your foundation. That's what David thought. We spent months measuring the basement, comparing it to these historical drawings. He was convinced there were hidden spaces that hadn't been discovered yet. The main floor showed signs of David's painstaking work, exposed beam ceilings, restored hardwood floors, and walls stripped back to their original plaster. But it was clear that his real focus had been elsewhere. He barely touched the upper floors, Sarah noted. All his energy went into the basement. He was obsessed with the foundation, with the idea that the original builders had hidden evidence of their Underground Railroad activities. Tom examined the restored woodwork with an appraiser's eye. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Isn't typical frontier construction? Whoever built this house had significant skills and resources. David researched the original owner, a man named Ezra Whitman, who arrived in Kansas Territory in 1866. According to county records, he was a stonecutter from Pennsylvania who claimed to be starting a wheat farm. But David found evidence suggesting Whitman had connections to abolitionist networks in Pennsylvania. Sarah led Tom to a wall where David had hung a timeline of his research. Photos, documents, and maps were connected by red string, creating a web of evidence that suggested the farm's true purpose. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a photograph of a gravestone. David found this in the Harper County Cemetery. Ezra Whitman died in 1869, just 3 years after building the farmhouse. The inscription says he was a friend to the friendless and a servant of justice. That sounds like abolitionist language, Tom observed. Exactly. And here's the interesting part. Whitman's death certificate lists the cause as injuries sustained in a fall, but David found a newspaper, a clipping from 1869 that mentions Whitman was found dead in his basement, apparently having fallen down his own stairs. Tom frowned. That's an odd coincidence. David didn't think it was a coincidence. He thought Whitman might have been killed to keep quiet about his Underground Railroad activities. The Civil War was over, but tensions in Kansas were still high. Plenty of people wanted to cover up their wartime activities. Sarah moved toward the basement door, drawn by the same curiosity that had consumed her husband's final months. She'd avoided the basement since his death. But today, with foreclosure just 3 days away, she felt compelled to see what had captured his attention so completely. "I need to go down there," she said quietly. "I need to see what David was working on." The basement. David found dozens of these letters, Sarah replied, all referencing a stone house in Harper County, describing secret chambers and hidden roots. He was convinced our farmhouse was this safe house. She showed Tom more documents receipts. For supplies delivered to the Harper County stone house, coded messages about packages and deliveries, and even a crude sketch showing the layout of a basement with what appeared to be hidden compartments. The problem is, Sarah continued, Dr. Running Bear needs physical evidence to support the documentary evidence. The letters prove there was Underground Railroad activity in Harper County, but they don't definitively prove it was at our property. Tom studied the sketch more carefully. Its basement layout. It looks like it might match your foundation. That's what David thought. We spent months measuring the basement, comparing it to these historical drawings. He was convinced there were hidden spaces that hadn't been discovered yet. The main floor showed signs of David's painstaking work, exposed beam ceilings, restored hardwood floors, and walls stripped back to their original plaster. But it was clear that his real focus had been elsewhere. He barely touched the upper floors, Sarah noted. All his energy went into the basement. He was obsessed with the foundation, with the idea that the original builders had hidden evidence of their Underground Railroad activities. Tom examined the restored woodwork with an appraiser's eye. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Isn't typical frontier construction? Whoever built this house had significant skills and resources. David researched the original owner, a man named Ezra Whitman, who arrived in Kansas Territory in 1866. According to county records, he was a stonecutter from Pennsylvania who claimed to be starting a wheat farm. But David found evidence suggesting Whitman had connections to abolitionist networks in Pennsylvania. Sarah led Tom to a wall where David had hung a timeline of his research. Photos, documents, and maps were connected by red string, creating a web of evidence that suggested the farm's true purpose. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a photograph of a gravestone. David found this in the Harper County Cemetery. Ezra Whitman died in 1869, just 3 years after building the farmhouse. The inscription says he was a friend to the friendless and a servant of justice. That sounds like abolitionist language, Tom observed. Exactly. And here's the interesting part. Whitman's death certificate lists the cause as injuries sustained in a fall, but David found a newspaper clipping from 1869 that mentions Whitman was found dead in his basement, apparently having fallen down his own stairs. Tom frowned. That's an odd coincidence. David didn't think it was a coincidence. He thought Whitman might have been killed to keep quiet about his Underground Railroad activities. The Civil War was over, but tensions in Kansas were still high. Plenty of people wanted to cover up their wartime activities. Sarah moved toward the basement door, drawn by the same curiosity that had consumed her husband's final months. She'd avoided the basement since his death. But today, with foreclosure just 3 days away, she felt compelled to see what had captured his attention so completely. "I need to go down there," she said quietly. "I need to see what David was working on." The basement stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the cool, dim space below. A single bare bulb hung from the stone ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the rough-hewn walls. David had been working to restore the original stone walls, removing decades of paint and mortar patches to reveal the craftsmanship beneath. The basement was larger than typical farmhouse foundations, with walls that were nearly 3 feet thick in some places. The stonework was precise and deliberate, each block fitted with the skill of a master craftsman. In the center of the space, David had set up a makeshift workspace stables covered with tools, brushes, and chemicals for cleaning stone. David was always talking about these stones, Sarah said, examining the carefully fitted blocks. He claimed they were arranged in a specific pattern, that the builders had incorporated some kind of code or message into the foundation itself. Tom joined her, running his hands along the restored sections. "I have to admit, this is different from other basements I've seen. These stones are massive, and the way they're fitted together, it's almost like they're protecting something." Sarah knelt to examine a section where David had been working before his death. He'd removed several layers of paint and mortar, revealing what appeared to be carved symbols on some of the stone's faint markings that looked intentional rather than random. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of small marks etched into one stone. David thought these might be Underground Railroad symbols, codes used to communicate with escaped slaves. The symbols were crude but deliberate, a series of lines and curves that formed patterns Sarah didn't recognize. David had made rubbings of them, and she could see several hanging on the basement walls, alongside his research materials. "Documented everything," Sarah continued, gesturing to the walls covered with David's notes, photographs, and sketches. Every symbol, every unusual stone, every measurement of the foundation. He was building a comprehensive record of the basement's construction. Tom studied the symbols more closely. These do look intentional. If they're original to the construction, they predate any modern alterations. Sarah moved to David's workspace, where his final notes were still spread across the table. His handwriting, normally neat and precise, had become hurried and excited in the final weeks before his death. "Listen to this," she said, reading from his last journal entry. "March 15th found additional symbols on the east wall. Pattern suggests a sequence, possibly directions. The stones in this section show signs of being moved and replaced. I believe I'm close to finding the hidden chamber referenced in the Blackwood letters." Tom looked up sharply. Hidden chamber? Sarah nodded, continuing to read. March 18th confirmed that 3 stones on the east wall are not mortared in place. They appear to be designed. We need to explore that passage, she said, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. David died trying to find this. I owe it to him to finish what he started. Tom hesitated. Sarah, we don't know what's back there. It could be dangerous. The structure might be unstable. I'm going in, Sarah said firmly. This is what David was looking for. This is why he was so excited. If there's evidence of underground railroad activity in that passage, it could change everything. She began working to remove the adjacent stones, widening the opening just enough for a person to crawl through. The stones came away more easily than expected, confirming that they were designed to be moved. This is definitely a hidden entrance, she said, examining the mechanism. These stones are counterweighted. Someone put a lot of thought into creating a secret passage that could be quickly opened and closed. Tom helped her clear the opening, his initial reluctance giving way to curiosity. If this really is an underground railroad hiding place, it's one of the best preserved examples anyone's ever found. Sarah positioned herself at the opening, flashlight in hand. The passage stretched into darkness, but she could see that it opened into a larger space about 10 feet in. The stonework was immaculate, showing the same craftsmanship as the basement walls. I'm going in, she announced, already maneuvering herself into the narrow opening. David would have wanted me to see this through. Let me go first. I'm smaller, and if something goes wrong? No, Sarah interrupted. This is my husband's discovery, my farm, my responsibility. Before Tom could object further, Sarah began crawling through the passage, using the flashlight to guide her way. The space was tight but manageable, and after a few feet she could feel the passage beginning to open up. There's a chamber here, she called back to Tom. It's bigger than the passage. I'm going to stand up. Sarah emerged into a space that took her breath away. The hidden chamber was roughly 12 feet square, with walls of precisely fitted stone rising to a vaulted ceiling. The air was cool and dry, suggesting excellent preservation conditions. But it was what the chamber contained that made Sarah's heart race. Along the walls, carved into the stone itself, were dozens of names and dates. Some were clearly African American names, others appeared to be the names of conductors or helpers. The dates ranged from 1858 to 1863, documenting years of underground railroad activity. Tom, you need to see this, Sarah called, her voice echoing in the confined space. This is incredible. It's like a guest book for escaped slaves. Tom's worried face appeared in the passage opening. What do you see? Names, dates, messages, carved into the walls. This was definitely a hiding place for the Underground Railroad. David was right about everything. Sarah moved her flashlight beam across the chamber walls, documenting the carved inscriptions. Some were simple, just names and dates. Others were more elaborate, including messages like "Freedom found here" and "Bless this safe house." But in the center of the chamber, she found something that made her gasp. A stone pedestal, similar to an altar, held a wooden box that appeared to be in remarkable condition despite its age. "There's something else here," she called to Tom. "Some kind of container on a stone platform." Sarah approached the box carefully, her historian's training taking over. The wood was dark with age but showed no signs of rot or damage. Bound with metal straps that had developed a green patina over time, "I'm going to open it," she announced, her hands trembling with excitement and anticipation. "Sarah, be careful," Tom warned. "If that's original, it could be extremely fragile." Sarah lifted the lid carefully, prepared for it to crumble at her touch. Instead, it opened smoothly, revealing contents that made her heart stop. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth, were documents that appeared to be in perfect condition. "Tom, there are papers in here. Documents that look like they were sealed yesterday." She carefully lifted out the first document, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was a letter written in the same handwriting she'd seen in David's research materials, but this one was different. This one was addressed to future generations. "To those who follow," the letter began, "this record is preserved for the day When the full truth of our struggle can be told without fear of retribution, what lies within this chamber is the true history of the Underground Railroad in Kansas Territory, and evidence of activities that continued long after the war's official end. Sarah's hands shook as she read the letter's final lines. The war may be over, but the fight for justice continues. Those who would maintain the old order have not surrendered, and those who fought for freedom must remain vigilant. The documents in this chamber prove that the struggle for American freedom is far from finished. The letter was signed E. Whitman, Conductor, Underground Railroad, 1865. Tom. Sarah called, her voice barely above a whisper. I think David found something bigger than just Underground Railroad history. This letter suggests there's evidence of ongoing resistance activities after the Civil War ended. As she continued examining the documents, Sarah realized that her husband had been right about everything. The farm wasn't just a failed agricultural venture, it was a crucial piece of American history. And now, with just 72 hours before foreclosure, she held in her hands the evidence that could save not just the property, but rewrite the understanding of post-Civil War America. The failing farm that had seemed like such a burden was about to reveal secrets that would shake the foundations of American historical understanding. And Sarah Mitchell, reluctant inheritor turned guardian of truth, was about to discover that some inheritances come with responsibilities far greater than she could have imagined. Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully lifted the second document from the wooden box. The oiled cloth wrapping had preserved it perfectly, as if it had been placed there yesterday rather than over 150 years ago. This document was different from the first. Instead of a letter, it appeared to be a detailed map of Kansas Territory, the routes marked in different colored inks and symbols that corresponded to the codes David had found carved into the basement. Stones. Tom, this is incredible, she whispered, her voice echoing in the hidden chamber. This isn't just evidence of Underground Railroad activity. This is a complete operational map of the entire Kansas network. Tom's anxious face appeared in the passage opening. What exactly are you seeing? Sarah held the flashlight closer to the map, studying the intricate details. Routes from Missouri through Kansas to Nebraska, with safe houses marked at regular intervals. Look at this. There are routes marked that continue past 1865. This suggests the network was still operating after the Civil War ended. The implications sent a chill through her. If the Underground Railroad network had continued operating after emancipation, it meant there were ongoing threats to freed slaves that history books had failed to document. This could fundamentally change understanding of Reconstruction era. America, I need to come out and show you this properly, Sarah called to Tom. But first, let me see what else is in this box. She carefully lifted out the remaining documents, finding a collection that seemed to represent years of careful record-keeping. There were lists of names, some clearly escaped slaves, others appearing to be conductors and supporters. Were coded messages about packages and deliveries. And most intriguingly, there were detailed reports about activities that extended well into the 1870s. Tom, there's something here about organized resistance to the end of Reconstruction, Sarah said, her voice filled with excitement and apprehension. Documents suggesting that the Underground Railroad evolved into something else after the war, a network, working to protect freed slaves from organized groups, trying to re-establish white supremacy. The historical implications were staggering. If these documents were authentic, they provided evidence of organized resistance activities that had been largely overlooked by mainstream historians. This wasn't just about helping escaped slaves reach freedom. It was about protecting newly freed Americans from systematic campaigns of violence and intimidation. Sarah carefully rewrapped the documents and placed them back in the box. The preservation was too good to risk damage, and she needed proper equipment and expertise to examine them fully. But even this preliminary examination suggested that David had been right about the farm's significance. "I'm coming out," she announced, carefully maneuvering herself back through the narrow passage with the precious wooden box clutched against her chest. Tom helped her emerge from the opening, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. Are you okay? You've been down there for almost an hour? I'm fine. But Tom, what we found down there is going to change everything. This isn't just about saving the farm anymore. It is about recovering lost history. They climbed back up to the main floor, where Sarah carefully placed the wooden box on David's cluttered desk. The afternoon light streaming through the farmhouse. Windows seemed almost mundane compared to the electric atmosphere of discovery in the hidden chamber. We need to contact Dr. Running Bear immediately, Sarah said, reaching for her phone. She needs to see these documents. If they're authentic, they'll provide the evidence needed for National Register status, and so much more. Tom examined the wooden box with new appreciation. Sarah, if these documents are as significant as you think, they could be worth, well, a lot more than the farm's back taxes. The thought hadn't occurred to Sarah. She'd been so focused on the historical significance that she hadn't considered the monetary value, but Tom was right. Authentic Underground Railroad documents, especially ones that extended the timeline of operations, would be incredibly valuable to collectors and institutions. I don't care about the money, she said firmly. David didn't spend his final months researching this place to make a profit. He believed in preserving history and making sure important stories weren't lost. She dialed Dr. Running Bear's number, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline of discovery. The phone rang several times before the historian answered. Dr. Running Bear, this is Sarah Mitchell. I think I've found the evidence you said we needed. There was a pause before the historian responded. Evidence of what, exactly? Underground Railroad activity at the farm? But it's more than that. I've found documents suggesting the network continued operating after the Civil War ended. Can you come out here tonight? Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Mitchell, I need to be clear about something. Oh. If you've found what you think you've found, there are protocols we need to follow. The Kansas Historical Society has specific procedures for handling potentially significant discoveries. Sarah felt a flash of frustration. Dr. Running Bear, I'm not trying to circumvent any protocols. I'm trying to save my farm and honor my husband's research. But these documents are going to require expert analysis. I understand here. Urgency, Dr. Running Bear replied carefully. But significant historical discoveries attract attention from multiple parties. Some of that attention might not be welcome. Cryptic warning sent a chill through Sarah. What do you mean? Mrs. Mitchell, you mentioned that your husband died while researching the property. Have you considered that his death might not have been entirely accidental? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the discovery that she hadn't fully processed the implications of David's final journal entries. He'd been excited about finding evidence, but he'd also been secretive about his research in those final weeks. Dr. Running Bear, are you suggesting that David's death was suspicious? I'm suggesting that significant historical discoveries sometimes threaten people who prefer certain stories to remain untold. Your husband's research was attracting attention from parties beyond the academic community. Sarah looked at Tom, who was following her side of the conversation, with growing concern. What kind of parties? The kind that have reasons to suppress? Evidence of ongoing resistance activities after the Civil War? Mrs. Mitchell, I strongly advise you to secure those documents immediately and contact the proper authorities. The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in confusion. In growing fear, the excitement of discovery was rapidly being replaced by the realization that she might be in over her head. What did she say? Tom asked urgently. She thinks David's death might not have been accidental. She said there are people who wouldn't want these documents to become public. Tom's face went pale. Sarah, maybe we should call the police and tell them what? That we found old documents in a hidden chamber? They'll think we're crazy? Then what do we do? Sarah looked at the wooden box containing the documents that had cost her husband his life. The farm was still facing foreclosure in 60 hours, but now she had evidence that could save it. The question was whether she could survive long enough to use it. We document everything, she said finally. David spent months researching this place, building a case for its historical significance. I'm going to finish what he started. Open David's laptop, which had been sitting untouched since his death. The desktop was covered with files related to his research photographs. Document scans, genealogical records, and correspondence with historians and archivists across the country. Look at this, Sarah said, opening a folder labeled Whitman Research. David was in contact with historians in Pennsylvania, trying to trace Ezra Whitman's background before he came to Kansas. The folder contained dozens of emails, dating back almost 2 years. David had been methodically researching every aspect of the farm's history, corresponding with university professors, historical societies, and even descendants of known Underground Railroad conductors. Here's something interesting, Sarah continued, opening an email from a professor at Gettysburg College. David asked about connections between Pennsylvania abolitionists and post-war resistance activities. The professor wrote back that there were persistent rumors about continued Underground Railroad operations well into the 1870s, but no concrete evidence had ever been found. Tom read over her shoulder. Until now. Exactly. David was building a case that the Underground Railroad network evolved after the war, continuing to protect freed slaves from organized violence. These documents provide the missing evidence. Sarah continued exploring David's research files, finding correspondence with the National Archives, the Library of Congress, and various state historical societies. Her husband had been building a comprehensive picture of post-Civil War resistance activities, and the farm had been the final piece of the puzzle. He was so close, she murmured, reading his final emails. Just days before he died, he was telling correspondents that he was about to make a breakthrough discovery. One email, dated just 2 days before David's death, caught her attention. It was from someone named Dr. Marcus Webb at the Institute for American Studies in Washington, D.C., an organization she'd never heard of. David, the email read, "I understand you're close to making a significant discovery regarding post-war resistance activities. I'd like to discuss your research and possibly provide resources for your work. Can we schedule a call this week?" Sarah felt a chill as she read the timestamp on the email. It had been sent just hours before David's death. She quickly searched for any response from David, but found none. "Tom, look at this. Someone from Washington contacted David just before he died, claiming to want to help with his research." Tom examined the email carefully. Institute for American Studies. That doesn't sound like a legitimate academic organization. Let me look them up. He used his phone to search for the Institute for American Studies, but the results were vague and confusing. The organization appeared to have a website and some academic publications, but there was little concrete information about its funding or leadership. "This is odd," Tom said. "For an academic institute, they have remarkably little public information available." Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, but curiosity won out. "Hello. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Dr. Marcus Webb from the Institute for American Studies. I believe your late husband was working on some research that might be of interest to our organization." Sarah's blood went cold. The same Dr. Webb who had emailed David just before his death was now calling her directly. "How did you get this number?" she asked. "We've been monitoring your husband's research for some time. We understand you've made some discoveries at the farm. We'd like to offer our assistance." "What kind of assistance?" "The kind that ensures your discoveries receive proper academic attention and protection. Some historical findings can be controversial. We help ensure they're handled appropriately." Sarah looked at Tom, who was gesturing frantically for her to end the call. "I'm not interested in your assistance, Mrs. Mitchell. I think you misunderstand the significance of what you've found. These aren't just historical documents. They're evidence of activities that some powerful people would prefer to keep buried. Without proper protection, you could find yourself in a very dangerous situation." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning. Your husband didn't understand the implications of his research. We hope you'll be wiser." The call ended, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in shock. The excitement of discovery was rapidly being replaced by fear. If Dr. Webb was right, the documents she'd found weren't just historically significant, were dangerous. "We need to get these documents to a secure location," Tom said urgently. "And we need to contact the authorities." "Which authorities? I don't even know who we can trust." Sarah looked around the farmhouse that had been her husband's sanctuary and was now feeling like a trap. The documents that could save the farm might also cost her her life. "Maybe we should just walk away," she said quietly. "Let the bank." Sarah looked around the farmhouse that had been her husband's sanctuary and was now feeling like a trap. The documents that could save the farm might also cost her her life. Maybe we should just walk away, she said quietly. Let the bank foreclose. Take the insurance money and start over somewhere else. Sarah, you can't just abandon this. David died for this research. If you walk away now, his death means nothing. And if I stay, I might end up dead too. Tom sat down heavily in David's chair, the weight of the situation settling on both of them. What do you want to do? Sarah looked out the window at the failing farm that had seemed like such a burden just hours ago. The sun was setting over the barren fields, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In the distance, she could see the cemetery where David was buried, where Ezra Whitman had been laid to rest over 150 years ago. I want to understand what David died for, she said finally. I want to know why these documents are so important that people would kill to keep them secret. She opened the wooden box again, carefully removing the oiled cloth wrapping from the first document. The letter from Ezra Whitman seemed to glow in the lamplight, its words carrying a weight that transcended mere historical curiosity. Listen to this part again, she said, reading aloud. The war may be over, but the fight for justice continues. Those who would maintain the old order have not surrendered, and those who fought for freedom must remain vigilant. She looked up at Tom. What if this isn't about the past? What if these documents prove that the struggles of the Civil War era never really ended? Tom considered this carefully. You're talking about a continuous thread of resistance and counter-resistance that extends from the 1860s to the present day, exactly. And if that's true, then there are people alive today who have reasons to keep this history buried. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The documents belong to us. Return them, or face the consequences. The message was accompanied by a photograph, a picture of Sarah and Tom entering the farmhouse earlier that day, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Tom, we're being watched, she said, showing him the message. Tom immediately moved to the window, scanning the surrounding fields for any signs of surveillance. I don't see anyone, but that doesn't mean they're not there. We need to get these documents to safety, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her fear. If David was right about their significance, they're too important to be destroyed or suppressed. Where can we take them? Sarah thought about Dr. Running Bear's warning about following proper protocols. The Kansas Historical Society has secure facilities. If we can get the documents there, they'll be protected while experts determine their authenticity. And if Dr. Webb's people try to stop us, then we'll know for certain that these documents are as dangerous as they seem. Sarah began carefully repacking the documents in their original wrapping. The wooden box that had preserved them for over 150 years would have to serve as their protection for a little longer. Tom, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we try to bring these documents to light, we're not just risking our own safety. We're potentially exposing a network of people who have been protecting historical secrets for generations. Are you saying we should back down? I'm saying we need to be prepared for the consequences. David thought he was just researching local history. He had no idea he was uncovering evidence of ongoing conspiracies. Tom looked at the wooden box with new respect. So what's the plan? Sarah glanced at her watch. It was nearly 7 p.m., and the Kansas Historical Society offices would be closed until morning. They had less than 60 hours before the foreclosure deadline. But they also had documents that could potentially save the farm and rewrite American history. We spend tonight documenting everything, she said. We photograph every document, every symbol in the basement, every piece of evidence David collected. We create multiple copies and store them in different locations, and then we contact Dr. Running Bear first thing in the morning and arrange to deliver the documents to the Historical Society. Once they're in official custody, it will be harder for anyone to suppress them. What about the people watching us? Sarah looked out the window at the gathering darkness. Somewhere in those fields, people were monitoring their every move, waiting for the right moment to act. We hope they're more interested in the documents than in hurting us, she said. And we prepare for the possibility that they're not. As if summoned by her words, a car's headlights appeared on the distant road leading to the farm. The vehicle moved slowly, as if the occupants were studying the property. Tom, "We may not have until morning," Sarah said, watching the car approach. "We need to hide these documents now, before whoever's out there decides to come looking for them." "What?" Car stopped at the end of the driveway. Its headlights pointed toward the farmhouse. Sarah and Tom watched from the window as figures emerged from the vehicle, at least 3 people, moving with the purposeful coordination of a trained team. "They're not here to talk," Tom said grimly. Sarah grabbed the wooden box and David's laptop, her mind racing through possibilities. The hidden chamber in the basement was too obvious if these people knew about the documents. They probably knew about the hiding place where they'd been found. "The barn," she said suddenly. David stored equipment in the old barn. "There are places we could hide these where nobody would think to look." They moved quickly through the house, gathering the most important documents and research materials. Sarah's hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. David had died protecting these secrets, and she wasn't going to let his sacrifice be in vain. The back door of the farmhouse opened onto a moonlit yard that stretched toward the old barn. Structure had been built around the same time as the house, and David had used it for storage during his renovation work. "Stay low," Tom whispered as they crossed the yard. "They might have night vision equipment." The barn door creaked softly as they slipped inside. The space was filled with David's tools, building materials, and the various artifacts he'd collected during his research. Sarah knew the layout well. She'd helped him organize the space just months before his death. "Over here," she said, leading Tom to a corner where David had stored boxes of historical documents. "We can hide the box among his research materials. It'll look like just another part of his collection." They carefully placed the wooden box inside a larger container filled with David's photocopies and research notes. To a casual observer, it would appear to be nothing more than part of his extensive historical archive. "What now?" Tom asked. Sarah looked toward the farmhouse, where lights were now visible in the windows. "Now we wait and see what they want." The sound of footsteps approaching the barn made them both freeze. Someone was coming, moving carefully but deliberately toward their hiding place. "This way," Sarah whispered, leading Tom toward a ladder that led to the barn's loft. They climbed quickly, finding positions where they could observe the barn floor without being seen. The barn door opened, and a figure with a flashlight entered. Sarah could see that it was a woman in professional attire, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "I know you're in here," the woman called out. "We're not here to hurt you. We just want to discuss the documents you..." Sarah looked around the farmhouse that had been her husband's sanctuary and was now feeling like a trap. The documents that could save the farm might also cost her her life. "Maybe we should just walk away," she said quietly. "Let the bank foreclose. Take the insurance money and start over somewhere else." "Sarah, you can't just abandon this. David died for this research. If you walk away now, his death means nothing. And if I stay, I might end up dead too." Tom sat down heavily in David's chair, the weight of the situation settling on both of them. "What do you want to do?" Sarah looked out the window at the failing farm that had seemed like such a burden just hours ago. The sun was setting over the barren fields, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In the distance, she could see the cemetery where David was buried, where Ezra Whitman had been laid to rest over 150 years ago. "I want to understand what David died for," she said finally. "I want to know why these documents are so important that people would kill to keep them secret." She opened the wooden box again, carefully removing the oiled cloth wrapping from the first document. The letter from Ezra Whitman seemed to glow in the lamplight, its words carrying a weight that transcended mere historical curiosity. "Listen to this part again," she said, reading aloud. "The war may be over, but the fight for justice continues. Those who would maintain the old order have not surrendered, and those who fought for freedom..." "Who do you work for?" Sarah asked, not moving from her position. "I work for people who understand the consequences of exposing certain historical truths. Some secrets are kept for good reasons." "What reasons?" Kane paused, considering her. "Answer carefully. Because the networks documented in those papers are still active. Because the people who have been protecting these secrets for generations are still alive. Because exposing them would put them in danger." The explanation was plausible, but Sarah sensed there was more to it. "And what about the people who have been suppressed by these networks? Don't they deserve to know the truth?" "Mrs. Mitchell, you're thinking like a historian, not like someone who understands modern security implications. Please come down so we can discuss this properly. Sarah looked at Tom, who shook his head firmly. Hey, they were safer in the loft, at least for the moment. I need time to think, Sarah called out. Time is something we don't have, Kane replied. There are other parties interested in these documents. If you don't cooperate with us, you might find yourself dealing with people who are far less reasonable. The threat was clear, even if it was diplomatically phrased. Sarah was caught between multiple forces, all of whom wanted the documents for their own purposes. Give me until morning, she said finally. I'll have an answer for you then. Kane stood silently for a long moment, her flashlight beam fixed on the loft. Finally, she spoke again. Mrs. Mitchell, you have until sunrise. After that, we'll be forced to take other measures. The agent left the barn, her footsteps fading into the night. Sarah and Tom remained in the loft, listening to the sounds of vehicles departing. But they both knew the respite was temporary. They'll be back, Tom said quietly. I know, but we bought ourselves some time. Sarah looked down at the barn floor, where the wooden box was hidden among David's research materials. The documents. That could save the farm, or also the documents that could cost her life. Tom, what if we're wrong about all of this? What if these documents really would hurt innocent people? Then we make sure they're handled responsibly. But we don't destroy them or hand them over to people who won't let the truth be told. Sarah nodded, knowing he was right. David had died trying to preserve these secrets, and she owed it to him to see the job through. We'll wait until they leave, she said. Then we're going to do exactly what we planned. We're going to document everything. Contact Dr. Running Bear and get these materials to the Kansas Historical Society. And if Agent Kane's people try to stop us? Sarah thought about her husband's final journal entries. About Ezra Whitman's warning that the fight for justice was far from over. About the networks of people who had been protecting and suppressing historical truths for generations. Then we'll know we're doing something important, she said. We'll do it anyway. As they waited in the barn loft, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just one day. She'd arrived at the farm that morning as a reluctant widow facing foreclosure. She was the guardian of documents that could rewrite American history, pursued by federal agents and threatened by mysterious networks with roots stretching back to the Civil War era. The failing farm that had seemed like such a burden was revealed to be the center of a historical conspiracy that had been hidden for over 150 years. And Sarah Mitchell, high school history teacher turned reluctant inheritor, was about to discover that some truths are worth dying for. Sarah and Tom spent the next 3 hours huddled in the barn loft, watching through the small window as various vehicles came and went from the farm. Agent Kane's team had established what appeared to be a surveillance perimeter around the property, but they hadn't attempted to enter the barn again. The waiting was almost worse than direct confrontation. They're being patient, Tom observed, watching a black SUV that had been parked at the end of the driveway for the past hour. That suggests they think time is on their side. Sarah checked her watch. 11:47 p.m. In less than 48 hours, the bank would foreclose on the farm, and all of this would become someone else's problem. But the documents hidden below them represented far more than just a way to save the property. They were evidence of a historical conspiracy that had been maintained for over a century. Tom, what if we're thinking about this wrong? Sarah said, quietly. What if the foreclosure isn't coincidental? What if someone arranged for the farm to fail, knowing that eventually the property would be sold and the documents would be lost forever? Tom considered this possibility. You're suggesting a long-term conspiracy to suppress these documents? Think about it. David's grandfather bought this property in 1952, according to local records. The farm started failing almost immediately. What if someone has been sabotaging the property for decades, waiting for the right moment to acquire it? Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the photos she'd taken of David's research materials. Among his documents were financial records, going back to the 1950s, showing a pattern of equipment failures, crop disasters, market timing that seemed too consistent to be coincidental. Look at this, she said, showing Tom a spreadsheet David had created. Every decade, just when the farm was starting to show profit, something would go wrong. Equipment would break down, crops would fail, or market prices would crash at exactly the wrong time. Tom studied the data carefully. It's possible this is just bad luck, but the timing is suspicious. David thought so too. He has notes here about investigating the farm's financial history. He was starting to think that someone had been deliberately undermining the property's success. The realization sent a chill through both of them. If Sarah was right, then the current crisis wasn't just about money. It was about a systematic campaign to acquire control of the documents and the land that held them. That would explain why Agent Kane's people are being so patient, Tom said. They know the foreclosure is coming. They probably have arrangements to purchase the property once the bank takes possession. Sarah felt a surge of anger. David spent his life trying to make this farm work, never knowing that someone was actively sabotaging his efforts. He died thinking he was a failure when really he was fighting an impossible battle. She looked down at the wooden box hidden among David's research materials. The documents that could save the farm were also the documents that explained why the farm has been allowed to fail in the first place. We need to get these documents to safety tonight, she said firmly. If we wait until morning, they'll be gone forever. How? The property is surrounded. Sarah thought about the layout of the farm, remembering the routes David had used to access different parts of the property during his renovation work. The old irrigation ditches. They run along the north side of the property, connecting to the county drainage system. David used to walk those routes when he was planning field improvements. You're talking about crawling through ditches in the dark, carrying irreplaceable historical documents. I'm talking about honoring my husband's memory and making sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Tom was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks. Sarah, if we're caught, we could be arrested, or worse. If we don't try, these documents will disappear forever, and David's death will have been for nothing. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Someone was entering the barn again, moving more quietly than Agent Kane had earlier. "Sarah Mitchell," came a whispered voice. "Are you in here?" Sarah recognized the voice. It was Dr. Running Bear from the Kansas Historical Society. The historian had somehow made it past the surveillance perimeter and was now standing in the barn below them. "Dr. Running Bear," Sarah whispered back. "How did you get here?" "I used routes that your husband showed me during his research. Can you come down?" "We need to talk." Sarah and Tom climbed down from the loft, finding Dr. Running Bear standing near the barn entrance. The historian was dressed in dark clothing and carried a backpack that suggested she'd come prepared for a covert operation. "Dr. Running Bear, what are you doing here? Trying to save you from making a terrible mistake?" the historian replied. "The people watching your farm aren't just federal agents. They're part of a network that's been protecting historical secrets for generations." Agent Kane mentioned something about protecting ongoing operations. What did she mean? Dr. Running Bear glanced toward the barn entrance, checking for any signs of surveillance. "Sarah, the Underground Railroad network didn't disappear after the Civil War ended. Devolved into something else, a network of people dedicated to protecting the descendants of slaves and preserving the evidence of historical injustices." The explanation seemed to contradict everything Sarah had assumed about the document's significance. "Are you saying these papers should be kept secret?" "Saying the situation is more complicated than you realize. The documents you found don't just contain historical information, they contain names, locations, and operational details about networks that are still active today." Dr. Running Bear opened her backpack and pulled out a manila folder. "These are copies of documents similar to the ones you found. They were discovered at other Underground Railroad sites across the Midwest. Every time someone has tried to make them public, the descendants of the people named in the documents have faced harassment, violence, and even death." Sarah examined the photocopies, recognizing the same type of coded language and symbolic markings that she'd seen in the wooden box. "So there are other collections like this? Dozens of them, carefully guarded by networks of people who understand the consequences of exposure." "Sarah, the people threatening you aren't trying to suppress history. They're trying to protect living people from the consequences of historical truth." The revelation forced Sarah to reconsider everything. She thought she understood about the situation. "But Agent Kane threatened us. She said we had until sunrise to turn over the documents, because she knows what happens when these documents become public." The networks documented in those papers have been providing protection and support to African American communities for over 150 years. If their identities are exposed, that protection ends. Tom stepped forward, his expression skeptical. Dr. Running Bear, are you saying we should just hand over the documents and forget about David's research? I'm saying you need to understand what you're dealing with before you make irreversible decisions. David was a good man, but he didn't fully comprehend the implications of his discovery. Sarah felt a flash of anger. David died trying to preserve these documents. You can't tell me his sacrifice was meaningless. His sacrifice was meaningful because he understood the document's importance. But he also understood the need for discretion. In his final email to me, he said he was planning to work with established networks to ensure the documents were preserved appropriately. What final email? Dr. Running Bear pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a message dated the day before David's death. He wrote that he'd been contacted by representatives of the protection networks and that he was arranging to transfer the documents to their custody for safekeeping. Sarah read the email with growing shock. David's final message suggested that he'd been planning to work with the same networks that were now threatening her. This doesn't make sense. If David was cooperating with these people, why did he die? Because not everyone in the networks agreed with his approach. There's been a split between those who want to preserve the documents in secret and those who want to destroy them entirely. The explanation painted a picture of competing factions within the same historical conspiracy, each with different ideas about how to handle the dangerous knowledge contained in the documents. Dr. Running Bear, whose side are you on? The historian was quiet for a long moment before answering. I'm on the side of truth, but truth that's revealed responsibly. The documents you found contain information that could help historians understand the full scope of post-Civil War resistance activities. They also contain information that could endanger people who are alive today. And what do you suggest? We do work with the established networks to ensure the documents are preserved and studied, but not made public in ways that could harm innocent people. There are ways to honor David's research while still protecting the people documented. In the papers, Sarah looked at Tom, who was following the conversation with growing concern. The situation was becoming more complex with each revelation, and the simple choice between preserving history and protecting safety was proving to be anything but simple. Show me, Sarah said finally. Show me exactly what information in these documents could hurt people. Dr. Running Bear nodded, leading them back to where the wooden box was hidden. Sarah retrieved the container and carefully opened it, removing the documents she'd examined earlier. Look at this list of names, Dr. Running Bear said, pointing to one of the papers. These aren't just historical figures. Some of these are family names that are still active in communities across Kansas. If this information becomes public, it could expose their descendants to retaliation. Sarah studied the list more carefully, recognizing several surnames that she knew from her work as a teacher in Wichita. These are families I know. Some of my students have these names. Exactly. The networks documented in these papers have been providing support, financial, legal, and sometimes physical protection to these families for generations. If their identities are exposed, that support system collapses. Tom examined the documents with new understanding. So these aren't just historical records. They're operational documents for ongoing activities, which is why Agent Kane's people are so concerned about their security. They're not trying to suppress history. They're trying to protect a network that's been serving African American communities for over a century. The revelation forced Sarah to reconsider everything she thought she knew about the situation. The documents weren't just evidence of historical injustices. They were evidence of ongoing efforts to address those injustices. But what about the academic value? Sarah asked. These documents could revolutionize understanding of Reconstruction-era America. And they will, Dr. Running Bear assured her. But through controlled disclosure to trusted researchers, not through public exposure that could endanger living people. Sarah thought about David's final months, his excitement about making a breakthrough discovery, his careful documentation of every aspect of his research. Had he understood the full implications of what he was uncovering? Dr. Running Bear, if David was planning to work with these networks, why didn't he tell me? Because he was trying to protect you. He knew that knowledge of these documents would put you in danger. He was planning to transfer them to network custody before revealing anything to you. But he died before he could complete the transfer, which is why you're in this situation now. The networks are split on how to handle the documents, and you're caught in the middle. Sarah looked at the documents spread across David's workbench, seeing them with new eyes. They weren't just historical artifacts, they were active intelligence about ongoing operations, containing information that could either strengthen or destroy networks that had been protecting people for generations. What happens if I refuse to turn them over? Dr. Running Bear's expression grew grave. Then you'll be fighting a war you can't win, against people who have been protecting these secrets for over a century. And you'll be putting innocent people at risk. And if I do turn them over, then the documents will be preserved by people who understand their significance. Studied by researchers who can be trusted with sensitive information and used to continue protecting the communities they document. The choice seemed clear when presented that way, but Sarah still felt conflicted. David didn't spend his final months researching this place just to hand over his discoveries to secret networks. David spent his final months researching this place because he understood the importance of historical truth. But he also understood the importance of protecting living people from the consequences of that truth. Tom had been quietly examining the documents while Sarah and Dr. Running Bear talked. Now he looked up with a troubling expression. Sarah, there's something else in here, something that might change the whole situation. He held up a document that neither Sarah nor Dr. Running Bear had examined closely, a letter written in different handwriting and dated much more recently than the Civil War rare materials. This is from 1952, Tom said. The year David's grandfather bought the farm. It's a letter from someone named Robert Kessler, explaining why he's transferring custody of the documents to the Mitchell family. Sarah took the letter, reading it with growing amazement. Tom, this says that David's grandfather was chosen as a guardian specifically because of his family's connection to the Underground Railroad networks. The purchase of the farm wasn't random, it was part of a planned succession of guardianship. Dr. Running Bear read the letter over Sarah's shoulder, her expression shifting from concern to surprise. Sarah, this changes everything. Husband's family were designated guardians? Then you have legitimate claim to these documents. What does that mean? It means the decision about what to do with these documents isn't up to Agent Kane's people or the protection networks. Up to you as the designated guardian. Sarah felt a surge of understanding. David hadn't just inherited a failing farm, he'd inherited a sacred trust, a responsibility to protect and preserve historical truth. And now that responsibility had passed to her. Dr. Running Bear, what does being a guardian mean, exactly? It means you have both the authority and the responsibility to decide how these documents are handled. The networks can advise you, but they can't override your decisions. And if I decide to make them public, then that's your right as guardian. But you'll also be responsible for the consequences. Sarah looked at the documents spread across the workbench, seeing them now not as historical artifacts, but as a legacy passed down through generations of guardians. David's obsession with the farm's history wasn't just academic curiosity. It was recognition of his inherited responsibility. Tom, this explains everything. David wasn't just researching the farm's history, he was accepting his role as guardian of these documents. That's why he was so excited in his final weeks. He'd finally understood what he was meant to do. And now that role has passed to you. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of generations of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Dr. Running Bear, I need to understand exactly what being a guardian means. What are my options? You can maintain the documents in secret, allowing only trusted researchers to study them. You can transfer them to institutional custody, such as the Kansas Historical Society. Or you can make them public, accepting the risks to the people documented in them. What would David have wanted? Dr. Running Bear considered the question carefully. Based on his correspondence with me, I think David would have wanted the documents to be preserved and studied, but in ways that protected the people they document. He was passionate about historical truth, but he was also concerned about the welfare of living communities. Sarah thought about her husband's character, his dedication to his students, his care for the communities he served. He wouldn't have wanted historical truth to come at the cost of people's safety. There's a fourth option, she said slowly. I could work with the networks to find a way to reveal the historical truth while protecting the people documented in these papers. Maybe some kind of controlled disclosure that satisfies both academic integrity and community safety. Dr. Running Bear smiled for the first time since arriving at the barn. That's exactly what a good guardian would do. Find a way to honor both the historical truth and the people it could affect. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their discussion. Through the barn window, Sarah could see multiple sets of headlights turning into the farm driveway. Agent Kane's people? Tom asked. Dr. Running Bear looked toward the approaching lights with concern. No, those are different vehicles. Sarah, I think we may have run out of time for discussion. Sarah quickly began repacking the documents in their protective wrapping. Who else knows about these documents? More people than you might think. Word of David's discovery has been spreading through various networks for months. Not everyone wants the documents to be preserved. What do you mean? I mean, there are people who would prefer these documents to be destroyed entirely. People who think the secrets they contain are too dangerous to preserve, even in controlled circumstances. The implications sent a chill through Sarah. She'd been thinking about the choice between secrecy and disclosure. No. But there was apparently a third faction that wanted the documents eliminated entirely. Dr. Running Bear, are we in danger?
How?
We're about to find out. Those vehicles. They're not from any of the networks I know about. The first vehicle reached the farmhouse, and Sarah could see armed figures emerging from it. These weren't federal agents or academic researchers. They were something else entirely. We need to get these documents out of here, Sarah said urgently. If these people want them destroyed, we can't let them succeed. Dr. Running Bear shouldered her backpack and checked the barn's rear exit. The irrigation ditches you mentioned, Can. You find them in the dark? I think so. David walked those routes dozens of times during his renovation work. Then we go now before they search the barn. Sarah secured the wooden box in a waterproof bag from David's supplies, while Tom gathered the most important research materials. The documents that had been hidden safely for over 150 years were about to be moved again. Continuing a tradition of protection that had been maintained for generations. Are you ready for this? Dr. Running Bear asked as they prepared to leave the barn. Sarah thought about David's final weeks, his excitement about his discovery, his dedication to preserving historical truth. She thought about the generations of guardians who had protected these documents, waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets. I'm ready, she said firmly. David died protecting these documents. I'm not going to let his sacrifice be wasted. They slipped out the barn's rear entrance, moving carefully across the moonlit farmyard toward the irrigation ditches that would provide cover for their escape. Behind them, the farmhouse was surrounded by vehicles and armed figures, but Sarah had the documents and the knowledge needed to honor her husband's legacy. As they reached the edge of the property, Sarah looked back at the farmhouse where David had died, where generations of secrets had been preserved, where the past and present had collided in ways that would change American history forever. The failing farm that had seemed like such a burden was revealed to be the center of a struggle between competing visions of how historical truth should be handled. And Sarah Mitchell, reluctant guardian of dangerous knowledge, was about to discover that preserving the past required risking everything in the present. This way, she whispered, leading Dr. Running Bear and Tom into the darkness of the irrigation ditch. David showed me these routes. He said they were part of the original Underground Railroad system. As they moved through the night, following paths that had been used by escaped slaves over 150 years ago, Sarah realized that she was continuing a tradition that had never really ended. The Underground Railroad had evolved into something else, but its fundamental purpose, protecting people from historical injustices, remained unchanged. The documents she carried weren't just historical artifacts. They were evidence of an ongoing struggle for justice that connected the past to the present, and her role as guardian made her part of that struggle. Where are we going? Tom asked. As they moved through the shallow water of the irrigation ditch, To the place David would have wanted, Sarah replied. To the people who can help us find a way to honor both the truth and the people it could affect. Behind them, the farm that had been David's obsession was being searched by people who wanted to destroy the evidence of historical truth. But ahead of them, in the darkness of the Kansas night, lay the possibility of finding a way to preserve both the past and the future. The failing farm had revealed its secrets, but the real work of guardianship was just beginning. And Sarah Mitchell, who had inherited more than just property, was about to discover that some inheritances come with the power to change the world. The irrigation ditch was deeper than Sarah had remembered, the water reaching nearly to their knees as they moved through the darkness. The concrete channel had been built in the 1940s, but it followed the natural drainage patterns that had been used by the Underground Railroad network over a century earlier. David had mapped these routes extensively, understanding their historical significance even before he'd discovered the documents. "Stay low," Dr. Running Bear whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of water flowing around their feet. "The people searching the farm will have night vision equipment." Sarah clutched the waterproof bag containing the wooden box, feeling the weight of generations of responsibility in her hands. Behind them, the lights of the farmhouse were visible through the darkness, but the figures surrounding the property seemed focused on the buildings rather than the irrigation system. "How far does this ditch run?" Tom asked, his voice strained from the effort of moving through the water while carrying David's research materials. "About 3 miles to the county road," Sarah replied, drawing on memories of walks she'd taken with David during happier times. "It connects to the main drainage system that runs all the way to Wichita." They moved in silence for several minutes, the only sounds, the splash of water, and the distant noise of vehicles at the farm. Sarah's mind raced with questions about the people who had surrounded her property. If they weren't federal agents or Protection Network members, who were they? And what did they plan to do with the documents if they found them? "Dr. Running Bear," she whispered, "you said there were people who wanted these documents destroyed. Who are they?" The historian was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "There are descendants of the people who opposed the Underground Railroad networks. Families whose ancestors were slaveholders, Confederate sympathizers, or later members of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Some of these families have maintained their influence over the generations, and they're still active today. More active than most people realize. They've evolved from crude racial violence to sophisticated political and economic influence. But their fundamental goal remains the same: maintaining systems that preserve their advantages while suppressing evidence of historical injustices." Tom stumbled slightly in the water, catching himself against the ditch wall. "You're talking about organized white supremacist networks?" "I'm talking about networks that have been opposing racial justice for over 150 years. They've adapted their methods, but their core purpose hasn't changed. And they see documents like the ones you found as existential threats to their version of American history." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold water. "So the people at the farm, they're not trying to protect these documents. They're trying to destroy them, along with anyone who's seen them," Dr. Running Bear confirmed grimly. "That's why we need to get you and the documents to safety immediately." The ditch curved to the right, following the natural contours of the land. Sarah remembered this section from her walks with David. There was a culvert ahead that passed under a farm road, providing temporary shelter and concealment. "There's a culvert about 100 yards ahead," she said. "We can rest there and figure out our next move." As they approached the concrete tunnel, Sarah heard the sound of vehicles moving along the farm road above them. The people searching. The farmhouse had apparently expanded their search perimeter, but they hadn't yet thought to check the irrigation system. "In here," she whispered, leading them into the culvert. The concrete tunnel was about 4 feet high and 6 feet wide, forcing them to crouch as they moved through it, but it provided complete concealment from anyone searching from above. "Sarah," Dr. Running Bear said once they were safely inside the tunnel, "there's something I need to tell you about your husband's death." Sarah's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I didn't want to say anything in front of the federal agents, but David's final email to me contained information that suggests his death wasn't accidental." Tom looked up sharply. "What kind of information?" Dr. Running Bear pulled out her phone, scrolling through her messages to find David's final communication. He wrote that he'd been receiving threats for weeks before his death. People had been calling the farm, sending letters, warning him to stop his research. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. He never told me about any threats. He was trying to protect you. But in his final email, he said he was planning to transfer documents to network custody immediately because he felt he was running out of time. Running out of time for what? He wrote that he'd discovered something in the documents that certain people would kill to keep secret. Something that went beyond just Underground Railroad activities. Sarah's hands shook as she processed this information. What could be so dangerous that people would commit murder to hide it? Dr. Running Bear hesitated before answering. Sarah, the documents you found don't just document Underground Railroad activities. They document the financial networks that supported both sides of the conflict. Names of banks, businesses, and wealthy families that profited from slavery and later from the systems that replaced it. You're talking about economic evidence. I'm talking about documentation that could expose the financial foundations of systemic racism in America. Evidence that some of the country's most prominent families built their wealth on slavery and have been actively suppressing that history for generations. Tom understood the implications immediately. That's why these documents are so dangerous. They're not just historical artifacts. They're evidence of ongoing economic conspiracies. Sarah thought about the letter from Ezra Whitman, warning that the fight for justice was far from over. Had he understood that the documents would document not just Underground Railroad activities, but the economic systems that made such networks necessary? Dr. Running Bear, what exactly did David discover in these documents? According to his email, he found evidence that some of the banks and businesses that were supposedly neutral during the Civil War were actually funding Confederate activities, while publicly supporting the Union, and that these same financial networks continued to operate after the war, using their resources to undermine Reconstruction and maintain economic control over freed slaves. The revelation was staggering. Sarah had thought the documents were about historical resistance activities, but they were apparently about something much larger, the economic foundations of American racial inequality. That would explain why so many different groups are interested in these documents, Tom said. It's not just about history. It's about exposing ongoing economic systems. Exactly. And the families that benefited from these systems have had over 150 years to accumulate wealth and influence. They have the resources to suppress evidence of their historical crimes. Sarah looked at the waterproof bag containing the wooden box, understanding now why David had been so excited about his discovery. These weren't just historical documents. They were evidence of financial crimes that had shaped American economic development for over a century. Is that why Agent Kane's people want the documents? To protect these financial networks? Partly. Remember, there are also protection networks that have been using this information to help African American communities. They have their own reasons for wanting the documents kept secret. The sound of vehicles passing overhead interrupted their conversation. Sarah counted at least 3 different sets of headlights, suggesting that the search for them was expanding. We need to keep moving, Dr. Running Bear said. The longer we stay in one place, the more likely we are to be found. They emerged from the culvert and continued along the irrigation ditch, moving deeper into the network of waterways that crisscrossed the Kansas countryside. Sarah's knowledge of the local geography, combined with David's research into historical routes, gave them an advantage over their pursuers. Dr. Running Bear, Sarah said as they walked, if these documents are so dangerous, why haven't the protection networks destroyed them already? Because they've been using the information to fight the same systems that other people want to preserve. The documents don't just expose financial crimes, they also document the networks that have been resisting those crimes for generations. You mean the information works both ways? Exactly. The same evidence that could expose historical financial crimes could also expose the people who have been fighting those crimes. That's why the situation is so complex. They reached another junction in the irrigation system, where multiple channels converged near a small bridge. Sarah recognized the location. They were about a mile from the county road, but also close to several farmhouses that might provide temporary shelter. There's a farmhouse over there, she said, pointing to lights visible through the trees. The owner is a friend of David's. You might be willing to help us." Dr. Running Bear looked in the direction Sarah indicated, considering the risks. "Do you trust him?" David did. "Right now we need all the help we can get." They climbed out of the irrigation ditch and crossed the field toward the farmhouse, moving carefully to avoid detection. The property belonged to Marcus Webb, retired teacher who had been friends with David for over 20 years. If anyone could be trusted with their situation, it was Marcus. The farmhouse was dark, except for a single light in the kitchen window. Sarah approached the back door and knocked softly, hoping Marcus was still awake despite the late hour. "Sarah!" came a surprised voice as the door opened. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, wearing pajamas and a concerned expression. "What are you doing here at this hour?" "Marcus, I need your help. It's about David's research." Marcus immediately stepped aside, allowing them to enter. "Come in. Come in. You look like you've been through hell." The kitchen was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold uncertainty of the night outside. Marcus provided towels for them to dry off and put on a pot of coffee while Sarah explained their situation. "So you're telling me that David was murdered because of historical documents he found in your basement?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "I know it sounds crazy, but we have evidence." The documents David found expose financial networks that have been operating since the Civil War era. Some people will do anything to keep that information secret. Marcus sat down heavily at his kitchen table, processing the information. David always said that farm was special, that it held secrets nobody else knew about. "I thought he was just being romantic about local history. He was right about everything," Sarah said. "The farm was an Underground Railroad safe house, and the documents we found prove that the networks continued operating long after the war ended. And now people are trying to kill you for these documents? People are trying to destroy the documents, and we're just in the way." Marcus looked at Dr. Running Bear, who had been quietly observing the conversation. "And you are Dr. Running Bear from the Kansas Historical Society. I've been working with David on his research for the past year. Can you verify what Sarah's telling me?" Dr. Running Bear nodded. "I've seen preliminary evidence of David's discoveries. If the documents are authentic, they could revolutionize understanding of post-Civil War American history," Marcus considered. This for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" "It's a safe place to examine the documents and figure out our next move," Sarah said. "We need to find a way to preserve them without putting anyone in danger." "You can stay here tonight," Marcus offered. "But Sarah, if these people are as dangerous as you think, they'll eventually track you down. You need a long-term plan." Sarah looked at the waterproof bag containing the wooden box, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with guardianship.
"Marcus, what would David have wanted me to do?" Marcus smiled sadly. "David would have wanted you to do what was right, even if it was dangerous."
He always believed that historical truth was worth fighting for. But he also cared about protecting people, Tom added. He wouldn't have wanted the truth to come at the cost of innocent lives. Dr. Running Bear leaned forward, her expression serious. "Sarah, there might be a way to accomplish both goals. The protection networks have been discussing the possibility of controlled disclosure revealing the historical truth while protecting the people documented in the papers. What would that look like? Working with trusted researchers and institutions to study the documents while maintaining security around sensitive information. Publishing the historical findings while redacting names and details that could endanger living people." Sarah considered this possibility. It seemed like a compromise. That could honor both David's commitment to historical truth and his concern for community safety. Who would we work with? There are historians and institutions that have been studying these networks for decades. They understand the sensitivity of the information and have protocols for handling it appropriately. Marcus stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the darkness. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. David came to see me about a week before he died. He said he'd made a discovery that would change everything, but he also said he was scared." "Scared of what?" He said he'd been receiving threatening phone calls, people telling him to stop his research, warning him that he was getting involved, and things that were bigger than he understood. Sarah felt a surge of anger. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I thought he was being paranoid. David always had a tendency to see conspiracies where none existed. I thought the stress of the farm's financial problems was getting to him. But now, you think differently? Marcus turned back to face them, his expression grave. Now I think David was killed because he discovered something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. I think you're in the same danger he was. The realization that David's death had been preventable, the people had known he was in danger but hadn't taken it seriously, filled Sarah with a mixture of grief and determination. Her husband had died trying to preserve historical truth, and she wasn't going to let his sacrifice be meaningless. Dr. Running Bear, I want to work with the protection networks, but I also want to make sure David's research is preserved and shared appropriately. That's exactly what the networks have been hoping for. They want to find a way to honor the historical truth while protecting the people it documents. Oh, what's the first step? We need to get you in the documents too. A secure location where they can be properly examined and authenticated. There are facilities that specialize in handling sensitive historical materials. Marcus cleared his throat. Before you go anywhere, there's something else I need to tell you. About an hour ago, I received a phone call from someone claiming to be from the FBI. They said they were looking for you in connection with stolen federal documents. Sarah's blood went cold. What did you tell them? I told them I hadn't seen you. But Sarah, if federal agents are looking for you, this situation is more serious than we thought. Dr. Running Bear frowned. That doesn't sound right. The documents you found are private property, not federal materials. Someone is misrepresenting the situation. Or someone is using federal authority to legitimize their search, Tom suggested. If the people looking for these documents have connections in government, they could be using official channels to track us down. The implications were terrifying. Sarah had assumed they were dealing with historical conspiracies, but if current government officials were involved, the situation was far more dangerous than she'd realized. We need to leave, she said urgently. If they traced us here, Marcus could be in danger for helping us. Where will you go? Dr. Running Bear stood up, shouldering her backpack. I know a place. There's a secure facility about 2 hours from here where we can examine the documents properly and contact the protection networks. What kind of facility? A research center that specializes in sensitive historical materials. They have the equipment and expertise to authenticate the documents, and the security to protect them. Sarah looked at Marcus, who had risked his safety to help them. Marcus, I'm sorry for involving you in this. David was my friend, Marcus replied. If helping you means honoring his memory, then I'm glad I could do it. They gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, but as they reached the door, the sound of approaching vehicles made them freeze. Multiple sets of headlights were turning into Marcus's driveway. Back door, Marcus whispered urgently. Go out the back and head for the tree line. I'll try to delay them. Sarah grabbed the waterproof bag containing the documents, feeling the weight of her responsibility more acutely than ever. The people pursuing them had resources and connections that made escape increasingly difficult. Dr. Running Bear, are you sure about this secure facility? I'm sure. But we need to get there before these people realize we're carrying the documents they're looking for. They slipped out the back door and ran toward the trees, leaving Marcus to face whatever questions were coming. Behind them, they could hear car doors slamming and voices approaching the farmhouse. This way, Dr. Running Bear said, leading them through the woods toward a road that ran parallel to Marcus's property. My car is parked about half a mile from here. As they moved through the darkness, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just 24 hours. She'd gone from being a grieving widow facing foreclosure to being a guardian of documents that could expose 150 years of American financial conspiracies. Dr. Running Bear, she said as they reached the road. What happens if we can't find a way to balance historical truth with personal safety? Then we'll have to choose which is more important, the historian replied. But I believe there's a way to honor both. The protection networks have been working toward this goal for generations. They reached Dr. Running Bear's car, a nondescript sedan that had been carefully positioned for a quick escape. As they drove away from Marcus's farm, Sarah looked back at the lights of the vehicles still surrounding his property. I hope he's okay, she said. Marcus is a smart man, Tom assured her. He'll be fine. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their escape had come at a cost. Too many people were being put at risk by her decision to preserve the documents. And she was beginning to understand why some guardians might choose to destroy them rather than continue the dangerous legacy of protection. Dr. Running Bear, have any guardians ever chosen to destroy the documents rather than preserve them? A few, usually when they felt the risks had become too great to justify preservation. But Sarah, once these documents are destroyed, the historical truth they contain is lost forever. The people they could endanger are safe forever. Until the next generation discovers the same truths and faces the same choices. Sarah understood now why David had been so excited about his discovery and so frightened by its implications. The documents weren't just historical artifacts. They were evidence of ongoing systems of oppression and resistance that continued to shape American society. "Where exactly are we going?" Tom asked as they drove through the Kansas countryside. "To a place where we can examine the documents properly and decide how to proceed," Dr. Running Bear replied. "A place where the protection networks can help us find a way to honor both historical truth and human safety." Sarah looked at the waterproof bag in her lap, feeling the weight of generations of responsibility. The failing farm that had seemed like such a burden had revealed itself to be the center of a struggle that had been ongoing for over 150 years. And she was about to discover that some truths are too important to hide, but too dangerous to reveal carelessly. The role of guardian required finding a path between these extremes, honoring both the past and the present in ways that served justice rather than destruction. "Are you ready for this?" Dr. Running Bear asked as they approached their destination. Sarah thought about David's final weeks, his commitment to preserving historical truth, his concern for the welfare of living communities. She thought about the networks of people who had been protecting these secrets for generations, and the other networks that had been trying to destroy them. "I'm ready," she said. "David died trying to preserve these documents. I'm going to finish what he started." As they drove through the night toward an uncertain future, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that some inheritances come with responsibilities that extend far beyond property or money. She had inherited a role in a struggle that connected the past to the present, and her decisions would affect not just her own life, but the lives of people she would never meet. The failing farm had been revealed as the center of a historical conspiracy, but the real work of guardianship was just beginning. And Sarah Mitchell, who had inherited more than she ever imagined, was about to discover that preserving truth requires more courage than she had ever been asked to show. The secure facility turned out to be a modest brick building tucked away in a wooded area outside Lawrence, Kansas. Dr. Running Bear led them through multiple security checkpoints, each manned by individuals who clearly understood the sensitivity of their work. Sarah clutched the waterproof bag containing the wooden box, feeling the weight of 150 years of preserved secrets. "This is the Midwest Center for Historical Preservation," Dr. Running Bear explained as they were escorted to a climate-controlled examination room. "They specialize in authenticating and preserving sensitive historical materials." The room was equipped with state-of-the-art conservation equipment, high-resolution cameras, and computers linked to databases of historical documents. Dr. Margaret Tall Eagle, the center's director, greeted them with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to handling dangerous knowledge. "Hey, Dr. Running Bear has briefed me on your situation," she said to Sarah. "We're prepared to authenticate your documents and help you determine the best path forward." Sarah carefully removed the wooden box from its waterproof protection, feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Hiding, she was finally in a place where the documents could be properly examined. "Before we begin," Dr. Tall Eagle said, "I need you to understand that once we authenticate these documents, there's no going back. The knowledge they contain will change how you see American history, and it will put you at the center of ongoing struggles that most people never know exist." "I'm ready," Sarah replied, thinking of David's sacrifice and her inherited responsibility. As guardian, the authentication process took 3 hours. Using specialized lighting, chemical analysis, comparison with known historical documents, the experts confirmed what Sarah had suspected: the documents were genuine artifacts from the 1850s and 1860s, perfectly preserved by the chamber's unique conditions. "These are extraordinary," Dr. Tall Eagle said, studying the hybrid Cherokee English writing system. They document not just Underground Railroad activities, but the entire financial network that supported both slavery and the systems that replaced it. The most shocking discovery came when they examined the business records hidden within the document collection. Names of banks, shipping companies, and textile manufacturers that had publicly supported abolition while secretly funding Confederate operations. More disturbing still were the records showing how these same financial networks had continued operating after the war, using their resources to undermine Reconstruction and maintain economic control over freed slaves. This is evidence of a conspiracy that shaped American economic development for over a century, Dr. Tall Eagle observed. No wonder so many people want it suppressed. But the documents also revealed something else, detailed records of the protection networks that have been fighting these systems for generations. Names of families, organizations, and individuals who had dedicated their lives to preserving evidence of historical injustices and supporting affected communities. Sarah, Dr. Running Bear, said, "These documents don't just expose the problem, they document the solution." The networks that have been protecting these secrets have also been using them to fight for justice. As they studied the materials, Sarah began to understand the full scope of her inheritance. She wasn't just the guardian of historical documents. She was part of a network that had been working for justice for over 150 years. "What happens now?" she asked. Dr. Tall Eagle smiled. "Now we give you options. The protection networks are prepared to offer you 3 choices. The first option was complete secrecy. The documents would be preserved in secure facilities, studied by trusted researchers but never made public. The second option was controlled disclosures. Elected information would be released to expose historical injustices while protecting sensitive details that could endanger living people. The third option was complete transparency. Everything would be made public, regardless of the consequences. "What would you recommend?" Sarah asked. "I'd recommend the path your husband was planning to take," Dr. Tall Eagle replied. "Controlled disclosure that serves justice while protecting people." Sarah thought about David's final weeks, his excitement, about his discovery, his concern for the communities that could be affected by his research. She thought about the generations of guardians who had preserved these secrets, waiting for the right moment to use them for healing rather than destruction. "I choose controlled disclosure," she said firmly. "But I want to be involved in every decision about what's revealed and how it's used." Dr. Running Bear nodded approvingly. That's exactly what a good guardian should do. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with the protection networks to develop a comprehensive plan for handling the documents. Selected information was shared with historians and civil rights organizations, providing new evidence for ongoing efforts to address systemic inequality. The financial records were used to support reparations cases and expose ongoing discrimination by institutions with documented histories of supporting slavery. But the most personal information, names of families, specific locations, operational details remain protected, ensuring that the people documented in the papers wouldn't be endangered by their ancestors' courage. The farm's foreclosure deadline passed, but Sarah discovered that the protection networks had arranged for the property to be purchased by a historical preservation trust. The farm would be converted into a research center and educational facility, honoring David's memory while continuing the work he had begun. "It's what he would have wanted," Tom said, as they stood in the renovated farmhouse 6 months later. The building had been transformed into a center for studying Civil War and Reconstruction history, with the hidden chamber serving as a museum exhibit about the Underground Railroad. Sarah had left her teaching job to become the center's director, finally understanding that her true calling was preserving and sharing historical truth in ways that served justice rather than destruction. The failing farm that had seemed like such a burden had become the foundation for work that honored both the past and the present. "Do you ever regret not making everything public?" Dr. Running Bear asked during the center's opening ceremony. Sarah looked around at the dozens of researchers, community leaders, and descendants of Underground Railroad participants who had gathered to celebrate the preservation of their shared history. "Never," she said. "David taught me that the goal isn't just to reveal truth, it's to use truth in ways that heal rather than harm." The wooden box now sat in a place of honor in the center's main exhibit, its contents carefully preserved and selectively shared with people who understood their significance. The documents that had been hidden for over 150 years were finally serving their intended purpose, providing evidence for ongoing efforts to create a more just society. As Sarah watched visitors explore the exhibits, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The reluctant widow who had inherited a failing farm had become the guardian of truth that connected the past to the present. The burden that had seemed so overwhelming had revealed itself to be a gift of the opportunity to continue work that mattered. "What's next?" Tom asked as the ceremony concluded. Sarah smiled, feeling David's presence in the restored farmhouse, where he had died protecting these secrets. "Next, we keep doing what guardians have always done. Preserve the truth, protect the people it could affect, and use knowledge to build a better world." The farm that had failed as an agricultural venture had succeeded as something far more important, a bridge between past and present, a place where historical truth could be preserved and shared responsibly. And Sarah Mitchell, who had inherited more than she ever imagined, had discovered that some legacies are too important to abandon, no matter how difficult they are to bear. The documents that had been hidden beneath the Kansas soil for over a century were finally free to tell their story, but in ways that honored both the courage of those who had preserved them and the safety of those who could be affected by their revelation. The failing farm had become the center of a new kind of success, one measured not in profits, but in justice preserved and truth responsibly shared. As the sun set over the Kansas plains, Sarah stood in the farmhouse where David had made his final discovery, surrounded by the fruits of his sacrifice and her guardianship. The story that had begun with a reluctant inheritance had become a tale of transformation, proving that some inheritances come with the power to change not just individual lives, but the trajectory of history itself. The Civil War had never truly ended, but neither had the fight for justice. And in a renovated farmhouse in Kansas, that fight continued in new ways. Guided by the wisdom of guardians who understood that preserving truth requires not just courage, but wisdom about how that truth should be used. 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.